Bidding wars for sought-after properties aren't new in big urban centers in this province, but houses and cottages going way over ask in much of the province sure is. And while that makes some people happy, sellers, those working on commission, and maybe even the province's treasurers, it's a tough time for buyers. Would change in the real estate industry itself help moderate overheated times such as these? Let's get into that with 5 guests, all of them in the provincial capital tonight. And as is our custom, we'll introduce them from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Victoria Village with Shane Dingman. He's a real estate reporter for the Globe and Mail. In Don Mills, Ontario, Lisa Patel, president of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. In Trinity Bellwoods downtown, there's Scott Ingram, chartered accountant and realtor with Century 21 Regal Realty. In Bedford Park, Tim Hudak, CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. And right near us at Yonge and Eglinton, or as we like to call it, Young and Eligible, Davelle Morrison, a broker with Bosley Real Estate Ltd Brokerage. And it's great to have you 5 on with us on TVO tonight. I'm just going to start, because we do this from time to time, in the interest of full disclosure. How many people here live in a home that they have purchased and own, or the bank owns it, or something like that? Hands up, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everybody. Okay, so we get that on the record, just in the interest of full disclosure, and start with this. Shane, start us off. Blind bidding has been in the news a lot lately, and we want to get a better understanding of the impact that has on prices. How does blind bidding work?
Well, in Ontario, you can have any number of ways to present an offer, but when somebody holds offers or they encourage multiple bids, what happens is, they put a date maybe on a piece of paper and they say, okay, everybody, on this day, I want you to present your best offer. And when they may say best offer, they really mean it, because you're not going to know what the other offers are. And so you go in there with your maximum bid in most cases, and you try to get it. And the reality is there's sort of a lot of gamesmanship that gets played here, and I'm sure the realtors on the panel will be able to speak to this more in their personal experience. But oftentimes they'll price it at sort of an enticing level, like $699 or for a condo or something like that, when in reality that condo is worth $800 maybe. And the goal is to try to get as many bidders in as possible. When you have sold over asking numbers that are like $260,000 over asking, that you could say that that's a froth in the market. It is, but it's also an example of like underpricing. So the way that these bids work is that everybody takes a blind shot at their best possible offer, and that automatically creates sort of a higher price than you might normally have been hoped to pay.
Well, let's find out. We'll go to some of the real estate guys on the panel. Davelle, in your view, does blind bidding inappropriately or in a distorted way push up prices beyond what they really ought to be?
I think that you have to look at a lot of different factors. So do I think that blind bidding works in the interest of the seller? Yes, it absolutely does. However, can you imagine being in an auction and sizing up the competition as a buyer and going, oh, I can spend more. Oh, that person looks like this. Oh, I can spend more. And all of a sudden, you don't have any time to think, yet you're now you're saying that you're going to spend more and more money. What I love about our process right now is it actually gives buyers time to think. They don't have to make a split decision. When they're asked for more money, they have the opportunity to consult with their lender, their banker, their mortgage broker, and their parents. So they actually have time to think, is this the best decision for me? If you move to a system where people are making a split decision, sort of auction style, nobody actually has time to think. And I think that that's a huge problem.
Scott, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I dislike it. I dislike it. You talk about the froth, but the part that I don't like, so every realtor and their clients are made aware of the number of total offers, and that's it, right? So no other details. But we're all told to bring your best offer, and then maybe if things are close, and every realtor's definition of close varies wildly, if you're close, you may be invited back for a second round. And then in that second round, that's where the real nuttiness happens, and people are feeling the pressure because, oh, I'm close. But you don't know if that's $5,000 or $50,000, and you don't know if you are the person ahead by $50,000 or behind by $50,000, and yet you are given the opportunity to improve. So it's the way things are allowed to be now, like people can bid against themselves, which I think is, and not all realtors will permit that. I mean, in my offer nights, I don't allow someone to bid against themselves, but others do.
Okay, let me read this tweet out here, and Tim Hudak, I'll get you to respond first to this tweet. This is from someone named Ben Rabidou, who runs a market research firm, North Cove Advisors, who cover housing issues, and he says, spoke to a realtor friend who told me about a recent sale where their client, the seller, received 2 bids on the house, one at ask price and one $175,000, or almost 10% above ask. There were only 2 offers. Blind bidding process needs to seriously be re-examined. So says Ben. What says Tim?
Well, number one, governments of all stripes, whether progressive, conservative, liberal, or New Democrat, have had the view that a homeowner should decide how they sell their home. That is, after all, their personal property. They'll be making decisions on what kind of home they want to buy, their retirement, and it's human nature to try to get the best return you can because you're planning for your future. I think the real issue here, Steve, is not the system of bidding. It's a lack of inventory and supply in the marketplace. And I'll talk about what Australia's Davelle did in a moment. So it's really sadly, like I totally get the buyer frustration right now. It's a cruel game of musical chairs. You have more and more people looking for homes, so fewer chairs available to find that home. And as a result, people get frustrated, prices go up. But it's not how you arrange the chairs. In Australia and New Zealand, where auctions are common, they're not mandated, they're common, they're experiencing the exact same thing. They're having record high prices, they have a lack of inventory, and an increased side of demand. So it's not how you arrange the chairs, it's getting at more inventory and supply in the marketplace to make sure home ownership stays within reach.
Since you mentioned Australia, we just happen to have a clip of how it works down there, down under. And Lisa, I'll get you to watch this and then comment first on this process, okay? Sheldon, if you would.
Let's get the show on the road. Who's going to give me a start now? How about we kick it off at $850,000? It's certainly worth more than that. Who would start me at that? Just put up your hand if you'd like to start at $850. You shouldn't be hesitating at that price. I'm at $850. I need to see a rise from there. 70, welcome to the bidding, sir. With my starter now at $870. 90, can I make it? 90, is it? Sorry, at 920,000. Great, strong bidding. Welcome to the bidding, sir.
Lisa, should we do that here?
You know what? My sentiments are very much in line with Tim Hudak, and I must say, like the sellers, obviously, when we think about houses today, we have to remember that the sellers should have the right of how they want their home marketed. We also need to keep in mind that, you know, even though that works in Australia, that's not going to work everywhere. And we have to keep in mind that even with blind bidding and the real estate transactions, that the new Real Estate and Service Act in Ontario already addresses this by giving the seller the option to disclose competing price offers. The industry is asking the province also to require the buyer's consent. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. But if we're going to move to a system similar, that consent must be heightened, and it must be consent from both the buyer and the seller. So all parties that disclose confidential offer prices that could compromise, because it could compromise their negotiation positions. But as Tim said, what this is definitely a supply issue. And I can say, you know, on TREB's position, one of the things that they focused on in their market year in review and outlook report, they've highlighted the missing middle research. And I'd encourage more people to even take a look at that report that was put out on treb.ca. Okay, I'm going to get to supply in a little bit, but I'm intrigued by this Australian example. And Tim, let me bring you back in on this. I can appreciate how perhaps in Sudbury on a Sunday afternoon when it's minus 25 outside, that may not be the easiest thing to replicate. But having said that, are they onto something there that we ought to look into here?
Well, it is an option. At least Patel, the president of the Toronto Real Estate Board, Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, talked about the process, right? We actually did, beginning with the Wynne government, we talked about ways to give more choices in the marketplace for how you buy or sell a home. And that was followed up by the Ford government that now more clear options in how you do so. And it's always existed in Ontario to an extent, right? But it's really, Steve, only about 1 or 2% of the market that goes this way. And typically, interestingly, around agricultural properties. I think most people watching, The agenda right there would be uncomfortable with that. I'd worry about, an auction on my front lawn that maybe Hudak was secretly smoking his cigars in the house or didn't take care of the place. Australia's had a lot of problems with people who are phony bidders, scam artists who, push up the price and get auction fever going. I'll stick with my guns here, see that it's not how you sell the house, it's lack of inventory. And good government policy needs to have a system that's going to work in up markets or down, because we're always going to have both.
Davelle, can you imagine doing it that way?
No, not at all. And to be honest, I want the government to stay out. I find that they don't do enough research to find out what all the problems are. And so when they create more policies, they end up creating more problems. And so to me, I think we have to kind of dial back to, why are people even asking this question about blind bidding? They're asking it because they don't feel that the system is fair, because they're losing. At the end of the day, there are always going to be winners and losers. And it almost feels to me like, how the kids now get participation badges for races?
Sure.
Instead of getting first, second, third? You know what? We need to have first, second, third. There's a reason for that. We can't turn real estate into a segment of getting participation badges to make people feel good. And, at the end of the day, if more people want to buy more houses, I go back to Tim's comments about, well, we need more supply. And unfortunately, I think in order to free up more supply, there needs to be a lot more work done by municipalities and governments to free up the supply. And it almost seems like they don't want to do that work. So instead, they want to blame blind bidding as the reason why we're having this issue.
Okay, but Davelle, let me push back a little bit, in as much as, there's no participation ribbons when you're bidding for a house. Someone wins. Lots of people lose. That's the way it is right now, right?
Because there's a lot of demand, because there is not enough supply. And so again, if we go back to ultimately what people are upset about is that they're not getting a chance to get the house. If you want house prices to go down, you've got to create more supply. And so until we start creating more supply, we are always going to have this issue of too many bidders on a particular house because there's fewer and fewer of them to buy.
Shane, to the extent that there is a fundamental unfairness in home buying and selling right now, what do you think it is, if you think there is one?
I think I hear what Davelle's saying, but to your point, a participation badge is that you miss out on a house by $100,000, right? You're already willing to spend maybe in Toronto $1.7 million. You didn't want to spend $1.85 million, so you lost the house. Everyone's talking here about, to be fair to the realtors on the panel and the people who represent realtors, they're talking about the fairness for the buyer, right? And it is in the buyer's discretion whether or not they want to have a bid system that is open or closed. They could have it open, but it's not in their interest. So why would we expect them to say, to be able to know you only have to bid $5,000 more to win this home, when if it's blind, they could bid $100,000 more to win the house. This took from Scott's example. So the buyer is the one who controls this process in Ontario, and you could easily make a change in legislation by saying if the buyer wishes to have an auction, it must be open. You don't have to have an auction, but if you want one, it should be open. So that's one way that you can make it so the buyer has their choice, but the choice comes with some responsibilities the seller has the choice, but the buyer can also choose whether or not to participate. The other thing that I have to think about is oftentimes you'll hear realtors talk about how buying a home is the biggest financial decision of your life. And then they turn around and say, but if you're buying that home, you don't deserve to have all the information in the market. You should not be able to know what other people are bidding for that house. That is not fair to the seller. So I kind of think it has to be one or the other. Either it's the biggest most important thing in your life, and you need every kind of protection that a fair system can offer you, or it's not, and it's a free-for-all, and you can just bid whatever the market will go for. But at the same time, I recognize these houses don't get sold unless a seller is willing to go out there and sell it. And so you need the seller to be involved in this process. So, but at the same time, with the current system, I think we just had our biggest March ever, 15,000 homes sold in the GTA. That's an enormous number. And so people are clearly able to buy, even at prices of average detached home in the 905 is 1.3 million, average home in 416 was selling for 1.7 million. There are buyers, but the sellers are the ones who control how much they pay.
Says that people are clearly able to buy. Let's clarify. Some people are clearly able to buy. A lot of people are getting shut out right now. And Shane, I wonder if you believe, not Shane, Scott. Scott, do you believe there is a fundamental unfairness in the home buying and selling system in Ontario right now?
I mean, I wouldn't say fundamental, but I do think the problem here boils down to transparency. And to me, more transparency is good in many facets of life. So I think that's what's really bugs people with this whole blind bidding, black box mystery thing. So when you're doing a regular old-fashioned deal negotiation, here's my offer, here's my counter offer, here's my offer, you know, everything's above board, you know what's going on. But when you're getting behind this multiple offer process and you're asked to improve your offer and you don't know where you stand, that's weird, and it's all more power to the seller. And you know, instead of getting more options for ways to sell your house, I think it's better if we had less, or one less, which would be getting rid of blind bidding wars. But that's that's my opinion. It doesn't favor, like, bidding wars favor the sellers for sure, but it favors the seller's real estate agent. And I guess if the buyers paid more, it favors the buyer's real estate agent too, because of higher price, higher commission. So the real estate industry loves it, and anybody who's getting residual benefits from that, I guess, like it was mentioned earlier, the governments with their land transfer taxes are getting more when prices are higher. So there's a whole bunch of people that are living large on escalated prices, or have an interest in higher prices.
No, I gotcha. There's a lot of people for whom it is a terrific thing that houses are going for so much. But Tim, given that you represent a province-wide organization, I want to bring you in on this next question. There's always a danger, I guess, in policymaking, and you would know from your time in politics, that you can overreact to a set of circumstances that may be existing for a short period of time, but it becomes a political headache for whoever's in power, and it's irresistible to try to do something. I was in Sudbury for the holiday weekend. There are homes in Sudbury that are, the bidding wars in Sudbury are out of control. There are homes going for $100,000 and $200,000 and $300,000 more today than they would have before COVID. So this is what my question is. There's all kinds of activity because of COVID now, people moving out of big cities into less populated parts of the province. Do we need to do anything in particular, given the times in which we're in, to change the system in light of that reality?
So you're absolutely right. You need to be cautious in terms of market intervention when it comes to unintended circumstances. Plus, what I expect we'll see is people go through COVID and get more comfortable with having potential buyers in their home. They see a higher price in the neighborhood and have a conversation among spouses saying, hey, maybe it's time that we downsized or moved to a smaller town and did more work from home. You'll see more inventory coming in the market. The biggest issue, though, is for government to take action. Here's some examples. In Sudbury, there's a mall there that they want to convert into residential spaces. So that could be more affordable options for people. Do more of that. I think there'll be an opportunity on the commercial side. Accelerate the approvals process. In big cities like Toronto, building above transit stations, looking at laneway homes. There's an awful lot of options here, Steve, to do so. We have a lot of information. We've done a lot of consumer profiling at OREA.com on what's happening in the market. You're right, there is a psychology. People are looking to more space in their home, more space in their yard as a result of COVID. We're seeing the mathematics of real estate, meaning that people don't have as much discretionary spending now. We're not going out, and they can afford more of the down payment. That's all competing up prices across our province. It's exciting to see a bit of a small town comeback, but you're right, we all aspire to be in a world where we could afford a home in the neighborhood we grew up in. That's a real challenge in small town Ontario too.
Okay, well, Lisa, let me bring it back to the Greater Toronto Area, which is your bailiwick. Every time I hear people say we need to increase supply, I know there is a segment of the population that says that's code for we want to build in the Greenbelt, or we want to build in sensitive lands, or we want to build on aquifers, or we want to build in places where really we shouldn't be building. How do you convince people that we need more supply, but we need more supply where it's appropriate, not on protected lands?
You know what? The obvious answer to that is really looking at the maps of Ontario. We actually need to, it's not only the real estate industry, but the government itself to show that the employment lands are protected, to show that the greenbelt areas are protected, and to show some of the missing middle research. And Tim touched on this in your last question. You know, talk about laneways, talk about how you can reinvent more housing and create different types of housing that will help with the demand.
Well, except, okay, I'm going to follow up on that. I hear you, but then I also hear municipal councillors who say, wait a second, I got constituents who don't want the density of their neighborhoods to increase 1 and 2 and 3-fold. So what do we do about that?
You know what? Okay, there's always going to, you know what? At the end of the day, we also know that we're always going to hear those comments, right? And realistically, we've got to show the vision of Ontario. I mean, we also have to take into account we have a massive amount of immigration to come into this country. So housing plays a critical role, and how that is going to be addressed. Everybody needs to come together in creating policies and change that is going to sustain this.
All right, Shane, can I get you to follow up on that? How do we get more supply out there when clearly there seems to be an interest in the status quo from many people who are already in, as opposed to those who want to get in?
Well, I think that there's two. I would say this. When I talk to housing advocates, we have to recognize we do have a housing shortage. It is enormous. It is in every category. It is affordable. We have a shortage in detached homes. We have a shortage in townhomes. The missing middle that people talk about, the real missing middle, not the 12-story places, but the 6-story places. So yeah, there is real need for zoning reform, right, to get rid of exclusionary zoning in neighborhoods all over Ontario that don't let you build apartments, you know, take a house and turn it into 4 apartments or something like that. Those are important. But I also think that we often, particularly among realtors, there is a reluctance to talk about other measures to control pricing. And one of the ways to do this is speculation taxes. Now, in 2017, when the market was behaving very much like it is right now, we brought in a foreign buyer's tax, and it was aimed at those sort of 5% of high-end properties that were selling for an enormous amount of price. Those buyers were not price sensitive, and they were distorting the market. But I think that we can look into the past as well and find examples of sort of speculation taxes. One of your favorites, Steve, Bill Davis, in the 70s brought in a home speculation, sort of property speculation tax, and it was a sliding scale. About 50% of the gains would be taxed if it was sold within a year, and then it carried on and got lower as you went out. So it sort of discouraged people from flipping. And that was like a pitcher of cold water in the market's face in the 70s, where they had prices growing similar to what we have now in the GTA, which is like 30% year over year in some parts of the market. Prices went down to like below double digits almost immediately. Now, it was realtors from that time will tell you it was horrible. It was a nightmare for them, and it just completely upended the market. But buyers, which we're talking about mainly, they loved it, and what's funny is that tax was repealed only 4 years after it was introduced because it kind of had done its job. So there are other measures than just saying that we need to jam more houses into all these neighborhoods that clearly don't want them. There are price measures. Another one that Vancouver has looked at is the empty homes and vacancy taxes. But there's also just even secondary homes, like the idea that if you have, I talk to people who are condo investors all the time, and there are people out there who own like 20 condos, and that's just their investment portfolio. They're collectors. They're not homeowners. Why do we give them a favored tax status? We should maybe, if we really think that home ownership and buying is important, we should discourage people from hoarding homes and tax them as if they are what they are, investments.
Tim, let me call upon again your political background. What do you do in a situation where you're a member of the legislature or a city councillor, and you've got a constituent who says, I just spent $5 million on a home and you want to build a sixplex right next door to me? Now, in terms of overall planning and dealing with the housing shortage, that's good planning. In terms of satisfying that constituent, you're going to be in trouble. How do you resolve that?
Yeah, that's why it's been so hard, particularly in larger cities, because politicians, especially local councillors, are going to be hardwired to think about the voters that are already there, not the voters that are yet to come. And that's why we've seen such resistance to really good ideas that would help bring homeownership closer to reach for millennials, new Canadians, or even people looking to downsize. That's why the province actually does need tools, whether they're, the carrot of incentivizing new housing by, transfers to help with infrastructure, recreation, et cetera, to help overcome the nimbyism. But you also do need to have the whip as well. If there's a difficult argument that you're not winning, but you have so many people that need homes, you do need things like ministerial zoning orders to go forward and make those tough calls. Like, I totally get it, but those same people who don't want that condo nearby, they also want their daughter and their son to find a place to call home. And the province really needs to continue on the path it's been on, because we're having this biggest generation now ever that is farther behind in getting a home. That's been such part of the Canadian culture.
Davelle, how would you organize that conundrum there? You've got on the one hand somebody who wants to protect their investment and bought a very expensive home for a very good reason, and yet somebody else wants to put a sixplex in next door.
So I live that every day because I live at Yonge and Eglinton. And, Yonge and Eglinton over the last few years has had a ton of condos, and there's a very strong ratepayers association here and a counselor that basically picket the condos. They do not want to have the large condos. But as a homeowner at Yonge and Eglinton, my property values are not going down because of those condos. And in fact, I would say to you that my conveniences of living in this neighborhood are actually going up because of those condos. I now have more stores to shop at, so I no longer need to go downtown. I can walk out my door and have every convenience that I need. So I think that the ratepayers argument is very short-sighted. And yes, at some point, they're going to want to live in those condos themselves when they downsize. They're going to want to stay in their neighborhood. And to stay in their neighborhood, they're going to need that condo. And for their kids to stay in the neighborhood, their kids are also going to need that condo building. So I think it is a huge problem that those ratepayers groups and some of those counselors are creating such a problem for building more. And on top of it, there's nothing wrong with people putting more basement apartments in their houses. Again, that actually helps people make their houses more affordable for them, which should not be an issue. A lot of basement apartments are huge in Vancouver because the housing prices there are higher than they are in Toronto, and that's how people make houses more affordable for them. They put basement apartments in. And the other thing is that in order to get more housing quickly, because obviously condos certainly take a long time to build, if they would allow more people to take a single family dwelling and turn it into 3 units. Right now, if there is one person that wants to take one house and turn it into 3 units, they're treated as though they are a developer, and they have to pay a huge amount of development charges, well over $100,000, just to turn one house into a triplex. What if you now have a senior who's living in this big house that realizes they don't want to live in a condo, they want to stay in their house, but they don't need all that space? That senior could take and cut up their house and allow more renters in, create more housing, and still stay in their home. And I think that we need to get a little bit more creative about those things to allow people to stay in their homes, but all those things would help increase the supply and also increase the rental market. We also have to look at the fact that the government is not building any affordable housing, and they're not building any rental buildings. The people who've been looking after the majority of the number of increase of rentals have been domestic investors. And yes, those are people who are buying condos and renting them out, or buying duplexes and triplexes and renting them out, because the government's not going to do it. So yes, private investors, myself included, are doing those kinds of things because, quite frankly, that's how investors are paying for their retirement. They do not want to put their money in the stock market. So real estate is another asset class for them to use. And that shouldn't be taken away from them.
I hear what you're saying, but Lisa, again, I think it gets back to the local politician who has to make a decision as to who he or she is going to listen to. Does that local politician listen to the one constituent who's already there, who's in the market, and who's got a big investment that he or she wants to protect? Or are they more concerned about the 6 or 10 potential voters that haven't moved in yet, that he or she doesn't know? I mean, if those are the two choices, I'm not a politician, but I got to figure out which way they're leaning.
You know what, you brought up a great point, and finding the happy medium is really the case there, right? I mean, you're pretty much damned if you do on one side, you're damned if you do on the other side. But the reality is there's going to be more than 6 to 10 that are looking to move in. But ultimately, it's finding that happy balance. Like, and reality is, we know that the supply chain is an issue. So we have to look at neighborhoods. We have to look at re-intensification. And I think that everybody on this panel has addressed that in going to this comment about looking at, which way do we find? There's always going to be an alternative, and an alternative that's gonna listen. It's not gonna make everybody happy at the end of the day, but there is going to be choices, and we also have to think not only on the scale of right now. We have to think about 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because as history has shown us, to change, looking at things right now in this perspective is not enough. We have to think 50 years from now. What is this going to look like? And that's where our decisions have to come from.
Well, let's say not even 50 years from now. Let's say 25 years from now, when demographers are predicting that we're going to see twice the population living in the Greater Toronto Area than we have today. Twice. I mean, that's astonishing. Tim, I presume, well, I don't know. Let me ask you. I would assume that the best real estate system is one where there is fair, rough justice between sellers and buyers. It isn't all in on one side or the other. How far away are we from that right now?
Well, we're facing a housing affordability crisis. And there's no doubt about that. And I've talked about options on how we can increase housing supply. Government land that's underutilized is another example of we can move quickly. I think in New York City, they brought in 200,000 or 300,000 affordable purchases by using government land. I suspect as a result of work from home too, Steve, there's going to be an opportunity for government to downsize its footprint in major urban areas like Toronto, the highest priced real estate market in our province, to put towards housing. I will say that beginning with the Wynne government, continued by the Ford government, they have brought our real estate standards to become North American leaders, a more efficient regulator to go after any bad actors, higher fines, a greater ability to rescind licenses, suspend them. So where the government should focus, high standards of consumer protection, making sure that we have leading professional standards, and put the energy into getting more supply in the marketplace, particularly for first-time buyers and move-up buyers. That's critical.
Shane, let me put the same question to you. You're a guy without a dog in the hunt here. You're looking at this as a neutral observer. How out of whack or out of balance do you think the system is right now?
I think it's really out of whack and really out of balance. And I think all you have to do is look at some of the research that has shown that Toronto's neighborhoods, these stable neighborhoods we talk about, are depopulating, right? You actually are having the neighborhoods getting older and fewer children and depopulating. At the same time, you have hundreds of thousands of people moving into the city. So where are they going? So we have this, we've seen in the maps now where like the concentrations of population and the concentrations of everything from COVID to poverty, clusters in these parts of Toronto. And you have these big neighborhoods that are sort of underutilized land, if you will. I think that oftentimes people talk about MZOs as a targeted sort of a thing, to do this piece of land or that piece of land, and they get in trouble when they go after sensitive wetlands, as they should. But maybe we should think about this more broadly and just say, if it was an MZO that said every single family sort of restricted zoning, area in the province now has to allow more people, you would get back to a kind of city we had in the 50s and 60s and the 70s even, when you had some of the biggest population growth and also one of the biggest middle classes you've ever had in this province. I think what we have to talk about when we talk about politics, when we talk about the existing homeowners, if you don't have the middle class, as Mr. Hudak well knows, you are not going to win elections in this province. And if you price the middle class out of the biggest city in the province, the capital, you're not going to have a lot of success with that demographic. So it is in the political interests of political actors everywhere to serve those people who want to get into housing market. And that doesn't mean just ownership. It means affordable rental. And all of this talk about missing middle and ending exclusionary zoning is not just for buyers. It's for people who want to live maybe at a reasonable rent in a city like Toronto. And we need those people to live here to serve, this gigantic economic engine. And if you don't have them, you chase them out of the city with high prices, you're going to have a bigger political problem than who's mad about what park hat going in what corner.
Shane mentioned Bill Davis a while ago. I well remember 35 years ago, David Peterson describing the Toronto real estate market as a sweet headache to have. Sweet if you're selling, a real headache if you're buying. Some things just apparently never change. But we'll keep an eye on this anyway. Shane, Lisa, Tim, Scott, Davelle, it's great of you to join us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.